Well, over the time, the rabble have won rights. They've won rights through struggle. They're not gifts from above. The rights include, for example, the franchise, the right to vote. And that brought, which is expanded. So in the United States, half the population was disenfranchised until the 1920s, for example, but it finally won the vote. And in the 1960s, the vote extended effectively to black population, which hadn't really had it before. So these are all victories for democracy. It extends the franchise, extends something. And those victories brought with them renewed fears of the rascal multitude and new and more sophisticated devices to control and marginalize them. Now, as the power of the state to coerce gradually declined over the years, these modes of coercion and control and marginalization shifted more and more to propaganda. And propaganda is naturally in the hands of the powerful, not for surprising reasons. In our own business-run autocracies, that means primarily business propaganda, and that includes media propaganda, the media just being big businesses. That's a huge phenomenon, some of it direct, like what comes out of the public relations industry in American creation. Not surprising in a uniquely business-run society with a highly class-conscious business community that is always fighting a bitter class war and it knows it. So straight out of the public relations industry and then out through its various outlets, including a good part of the media and the academic profession and so on. The leading student of 20th century of business propaganda, an Australian, Alex Carey, who's written very interesting things about the United States and is unknown here. He opened some of his work with the following comment, which I think is quite accurate. He says, the 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance. The first is the growth of democracy. The second is the growth of corporate power. And the third is the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. Now, that's quite right. And that's, in fact, the new version of the methods of the fear of the rascal multitude and the methods of controlling them. And we see that if we look at recent American history. So start with, say, the First World War, which was important. The First World War taught quite important lessons in this regard. Woodrow Wilson created the first official government propaganda agency, Creel Commission, designed to try to drive what was in fact a very pacifist country into war. He was particularly aided by the people who modestly called themselves the most intelligent members of the society, the liberal intellectuals, who took pride in the fact that for the first time in history, a population had been driven into war not by generals and other rotten people, but by the smart guys who perceived that it was the right thing to do. In fact, what they were doing was disseminating fabrications concocted by the British Ministry of Information about, Belgian babies with their arms ripped off and various other propaganda that was designed by the British, as they put it, to try to control the thought of the world. Well, the ones that they were most easily able to control were the most intelligent members of the society here, self-designated, namely the serious intellectuals who propounded all of this stuff with great sobriety and later took great credit for what they'd achieved. Whoever owns this is going to get a bit of silence. This was quite successful, this business propaganda, and it impressed people. Woodrow Wilson himself was called the great generalissimo of the propaganda, on the propaganda front, a phrase that was used by Harold Lasswell, one of the leading figures in contemporary political science, the founder of the modern field of communications and so on, who began a very influential career by studying wartime propaganda. The success of the Generalissimo was substantial, and it impressed several audiences. One audience that it impressed was the most important one, the American business community. It gave a big shot in the arm to the public relations industry, which had existed, but it really took off, very much influenced by the successes of the Generalissimo. In fact, the Generalissimo of corporate propaganda, Edward Bernays, who lived here, was part of the was in the Wilson propaganda agency, and he learned a lot from it. He developed the ideas, which he later propounded, which were that the essence of democracy is propaganda, what he sometimes called the engineering of consent. And it's quite obvious who's going to do the engineering, but though obvious, unsaid, because that's not one of the things you're supposed to say. Another person who was quite impressed by the successes of Anglo-American propaganda was Adolf Hitler. If you read Mein Kampf, you'll notice that he thinks Germany's defeat in the First World War was in large part due to the inability of autocratic, authoritarian Germany to compete on the propaganda front with the democratic societies, which really carried out thought control much more efficiently and effectively. He's actually quite right about that. And in Mein Kampf, he sort of promised next time around, they'd have their own propaganda agencies. Whether they succeeded equally to ours or not, is another question. But again, we'll put that one aside. A third group, audience that was deeply impressed were American intellectuals, people like Harold Lasswell, for example. They were not particularly cognizant of the fact that they were the main victims of the propaganda. That sort of was true, but you don't want to think that about yourself. Lasswell was the author, for example, of in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences in 1933 or 34, he was the author of an important article called Propaganda. In those days, people were a little more honest. We don't use the term now. We use other terms like journalism or something like that. But in those days, they were pretty straight. It was called propaganda. And he recognized that propaganda is necessary in any society, and more necessary in a society that's more free. The logic is sort of obvious. If you can control people with a whip, you don't really care all that much what they think. I think that's probably part of the reason why the Soviet Union wasn't very repressive with regard to, say, samizdat and foreign broadcasts. They were to an extent, but nowhere near what they could have been, because it really didn't matter all that much. You got to bludgeon over people's heads. Here it matters a lot more what people think, so propaganda has to be far more sophisticated and much more intensive, as Lasswell and others realized. Propaganda, he wrote back in the 1930s, is a new technique of control of the general public, who are a threat because of what he called the ignorance and stupidity of the masses. And we must not, he said, succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. We are the best judges. That you'll recognize from the two alternatives that Jefferson counterposed in 1826. I won't reread them, but notice that Jefferson's worst fears became the credo of the modern liberal intellectuals. In fact, of the intellectual community rather generally. Bolshevism is a subcase of this. Not very different if you think it through, a fact which was long noted by libertarian, by anarchist thinkers, and in fact predicted by Bakunin long before the Bolshevik Revolution. He predicted that there'd be two forms of modern intellectuals, what he called the red bureaucracy, who would use popular struggles to try to take control of state power and institute the most vicious and ruthless dictatorships in history. And the other group who would see that there isn't going to be an access to power that way and would therefore become the servants of private power and state capitalist democracy, where they would, as Bakunin put it, beat the people with the people's stick. Talk about democracy, but beat the people with it. That's actually one of the few predictions in the social sciences that's come true, to my knowledge, and a pretty perceptive one. Well, that's the credo of 20th century intellectual life to quite a remarkable extent, and it shows how much we have declined since Jefferson's day. Jefferson was hoping that the alternative would turn out to be true. This is what did turn out to be true, his worst fears. This should be part of intellectual history in a free society. It's the kind of thing you ought to learn in elementary school. Jefferson's distinction applies with precision to the modern age, except everything has been reversed and forgotten. Well, this is also pretty standard in the academic culture. So, for example, the president of the American Political Science Association in 1934, Harold Gosnell, in his presidential address advised, this is right in the period of the big ferment in the Depression, remember, worker struggles, everybody uprising. He said that we must, I'm quoting him, exclude the ignorant, the uninformed, and antisocial elements from the political arena. That's almost everybody, if you look at what he's talking about. What we need is an aristocracy. We need an aristocracy of intellect and character. The men of brains must seize the torch, the action intellectuals of the Kennedy period, for example. Now, there's an unspoken assumption in all of this, unspoken and possibly unnoticed, since it's not nice to see yourself in a mirror. The unspoken assumption is that we can seize the torch, these guys can seize the torch insofar as they keep well within the shadow that's cast by big business that we call politics. If they move a little bit beyond that shadow or even to its margins, they forfeit their place within the aristocracy of intellect and character. Well, as I say, that's not much discussed, though an obvious truth. The leading thinker, the leading exponent of these doctrines, and one of the most influential ones, was Walter Lippmann, who was the leading figure in American journalism for half a century, major commentator on foreign affairs, and also a highly regarded called progressive political theorist. His view, he made a distinction between what he called the responsible men, very small number. He was, of course, one of them. Everyone who presents the views is always within the group of the men of best quality and the aristocracy of intellect and character and so on. So there's the responsible men on the one side, and then there's the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, who are the population. Now, it's a democracy, so the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders have a role or a function, as he put it. Their function in a democracy is to be spectators, not participants. But they are allowed to, as he put it, lend their weight periodically to one or another member of the responsible men, the men of best quality. That's called an election. And then they're supposed to go home and watch the Super Bowl or whatever the equivalent was in the 1920s.